we have always looked at situations that can, now we have learned, are being called de facto with a special interest. And we have done that for the last, I would say, 20 years, because we have always been interested, rather than in absolute national sovereignty, in the way in which a society, however you wanted to define a society, is or can be organized. And the two situations that we will listen about later on are two situations in which, in fact, despite the lack of international recognition, efforts to try and shape the local institutions in a democratic way have always been one of the objectives of the local administrations.
The presence of de facto states, or unrecognized states as we sometimes refer to them, in the international system raises a number of questions for both scholars and policymakers. First, what is a state? On what basis does the international community recognize some entities as states, while others do not receive a similar stamp of approval? While some argue that de facto states are sources for instability, others point out that many de facto states are as stable as, or even more stable than, the states that the international community recognizes. What are the sources for internal legitimacy of de facto states? And finally, are unrecognized states or de facto states viable entities? The most important step or condition for providing answers or hypotheses to some of these questions is to know more empirically about what goes on within de facto states.
Somaliland, which is a de facto country, can offer something to the international community in terms of international cooperation. It can offer peace and security and bring stability to the Horn of Africa. It offers democratic way of life, social and economic development to its forward-looking people.
According to agreement with the international donors, Somaliland must pay 25% of the total cost of the election. The House of Elders set the new date for the election, and the National Electoral Commission has accepted the date and lastly signed it by the President of Somaliland. Therefore, it's very essential now that all stakeholders focus all their energies on creating solutions in order to further Somaliland's democratization process.
Recently, the fall of the Soviet Union gave rise to very deep-rooted changes, and so far we can't really forecast the consequences of this. The yoke of the Soviet Union not only created opportunities, but created really tough problems and conflicts. The conflict between Abkhazia and Georgia, for example, is part and parcel of a whole chain of nationalist movements post-Soviet. In every individual case, conflict was based on national minorities, seeing that were discriminated against, infringements of human rights or economic suppression or oppression by ethnic majorities.
Georgian President Saakashvili came to the European Parliament talking about the aspiration of Georgia to become part, in the long run, of course, of the European Union. We did not give any clear perspective of the fact that we are not a geographical entity, or even worse, a religious entity or religious-based entity. We should be a political entity, open to the maximum recognition of the rule of law and individual civil and political rights.
I would like to go to some suggestion more than proposal, or some proposal. The first one is to request UN a moratorium. That means recognize all. Second, giving an organization, could be even UNPO, an observer status in one of the bodies of the United Nations, an example, the Economic and Social Council, representing the unrepresented de facto states of people. Those de facto states, and the order that I quote, are banned from any affiliate organization to the United Nations.
We look with hope to everything which is happening in Europe. So democracy and freedom in Europe will one day become a reality for us too. At the same time, you can see a lessening of democracy and freedoms in our countries, and that has an effect in turn on security even in Europe. and migration, uncontrolled migratory flows. We're asking free thinking people, intellectuals in Europe, that they generate a vision. Europe is an idea which is based on the civilization of this continent. You can't have a union of states just represented by bureaucrats and their governments. That's not the sort of Europe I look to. Europe has always been thought of as a Europe of people, human beings, citizens, as in Athens and the polis 2,000 years ago. And therefore I'm fighting for the European Republic in those terms, and also for democracy at European level.
I think we need to think about how we can improve integration, which is what most interests us. Now, what I did say is that it's obviously true that we can't just override the Constitution or the treaties. We need to deal with them as well. And I think that if we look at the context, it's a useful starting point. Given economic, demographic and historical trends, it seems to me that as the differences between countries and groups of countries increase, we have increasing problems. And I think this is something which Italy really needs to consider carefully.
First, because it's the first and most prominent issue, the financial and the economic crisis. Now, there's been the start of the correct process, policy process, which, if it goes well, will finish up with a strengthened regulatory framework for the financial sector. The second response to the economic crisis has not yet been seen, and I deplore the fact that the Commission has been so backward in coming forward with its plans to reform the financial system of the EU itself.
When Joe Leinen spoke, I think what he said was interesting in terms of the title of the conference, the return of national or nation-state-based approach in Europe, which is nationalist and protectionist in economic terms. Ratification of the treaty is essential. If it's not ratified, well, who knows what will happen.
All religious teachers were convened by the Pope. It's a very serious thing, because not only the teachers of religion are chosen by the bishop and then sent to the state institutions and they become civil servants, and they teach religion as long as the bishop agrees. Once the bishop doesn't agree anymore, anybody who taught religion is now being asked to teach other subjects.